There's a way we've been taught to look at history, through flags, through wars, through the faces of powerful men, through maps that change color, treaties that get signed, anniversaries marked with parades. But what happens if we turn the angle just a little? What if, instead of looking at who ruled, we ask how people were moved, captured, displaced, used? This is a story about Ukraine. But not just the Ukraine of headlines or borders. This is the story of a land that has, for centuries, existed at the edge of empires and the center of appetites. A land whose soil is so rich that armies have marched across it for generations. A land so open, so accessible, so abundant, that it has invited not just settlement or trade, but extraction. We often talk about slavery and human trafficking as things of the past, or as crises that happen elsewhere. But what if we understood them instead as structures that adapt, not disappearing but evolving? What if we followed their shape across centuries into new languages and institutions, through new uniforms into new markets? What if we recognized that captivity doesn't always come with chains, that it can wear the clothing of law, of ideology, of economic necessity? In Ukraine, these patterns are unusually visible. This is a place where human life, its movement, its labor, its identity, has been commodified again and again. Not always in the same form and not always with the same rhetoric, but with the same result. People taken from their homes, renamed, repurposed, or erased to serve the ambitions of forces far larger than themselves. This story isn't to define villains and victims. It's not a simple indictment or a morality play. It's about seeing clearly, seeing how power operates when it isn't announcing itself, how systems of control persist long after the prisons have emptied and the banners have changed, and how a place like Ukraine can teach us to recognize those systems, not just in history books, but in the world we're still living in. So as you listen, I invite you to keep something in mind. When you hear about raids or deportations, about famines or revolutions, about liberation or reform, ask yourself not just what happened, but what changed. Who was able to move? Who wasn't? Who had the right to stay? Who had the power to take? What kinds of control replaced the old ones, and what did they keep hidden? Because underneath the ideologies, underneath the armies and the speeches, there is a quieter, older engine still turning, one that sees people not as citizens or individuals, but as resources to be managed. This is the story of Ukraine, but it's also the story of what happens when human life is treated as a commodity across generations, and it's a story still unfolding. The Black Sea wind cuts through the narrow alleys of Chersonesus, a sunlit Byzantine outpost nestled in the rocky coast of southern Crimea. Soldiers in scale armor sip sour wine in the shade of marble columns, watching the harbor where Greek merchants unload amphorae and Slavic slaves, bound for the markets of Constantinople. Beyond the city walls lies a fragile edge, a world where order dissolves into the steppe. In 4th and 5th centuries, Byzantium is the last vestige of Rome, and it clings to Crimea with a mix of diplomacy, garrisons, and coin. The coast is Hellenized, but the interior belongs to shadows. Goths who fled the Huns and carved out enclaves in the mountains, Alans herding across the plains, and tribal Slavs pushing slowly southward from the forests. The Dnieper River Valley is not yet a nation, but a thoroughfare of raiders and traders. To the south, Byzantium needs grain and manpower. To the north, the vast forests and swamps teem with scattered tribes, many of them prey. Slavery is not incidental, it is systemic. When a band of Slavic warriors storms a rival village, they don't just seize land. They take captives, women, children, artisans, marching them south. A minor Gothic lord in the Crimean hills offers his loyalty to the emperor in exchange for weapons and wine. But he also offers something else. Young Slavic girls from the hinterlands, branded and collared, destined for silk-draped chambers in Constantinople or grim galley benches on the Aegean. Without strong states, ethnicity is fluid and vulnerable. Political authority doesn't protect people, it commodifies them. The further you live from the city walls, the more likely you are to be taken. And so, from the forests of what will one day be Ukraine to the marble ports of Byzantium, a corridor of exploitation forms, facilitated by trade, cemented by conflict. The sky over the steppe burns gold as an Avar war band rides westward, dust rising behind them like storm clouds. Beneath their hooves lie fields abandoned, villages burnt. A Slavic elder watches from the trees, silent. He has seen this before. He knows they will not return for weeks, but when they do, they will demand grain, iron, and the strongest sons of the tribe. The tribe will obey. It always does. In the 6th century, the Avars arrive like thunder from the east, crashing into the Balkans and the forest steppe zones of Ukraine. Their chieftains are ruthless, calculating, and skilled at reducing resistance into revenue. The Slavs, still fragmented, tribal, decentralized, fall into a pattern: submit or be destroyed. But submission comes at a cost. The Avars don't just demand loyalty, they demand bodies. Young men for conscription, young women for sale. A slave girl taken from the Dnieper forests might pass through 5 hands before reaching the slave bazaar in Thessalonica. Along the way, she becomes currency. The Slavs are not always passive. The anti-confederation, an early attempt at regional unity, resists the Avars. They ally briefly with Byzantium, offering military support in return for grain and security. But the empire is cautious, distracted, and deeply pragmatic. When the Avars sack a Slavic village, Byzantium often looks the other way, so long as trade continues and the frontiers hold. Ethnically, the landscape begins to change. Avars settle, intermarry, and blur with conquered peoples. Slavs migrate further into the Danube basin and the forest steppe, mixing with local Iranian remnants like the Alans, and assimilating tribal structures into proto-states. Slavery, in this milieu, is both a weapon and a medium of exchange, a way to consolidate power, appease overlords, and signal political relevance. This is a time when political control is brittle, but economic logic is fierce. Those who can extract, whether by force or treaty, dominate. Those who cannot vanish. Along the lower Volga, a Khazar tax collector counts silver dirhams under the morning sun. Around him rise the tents of a caravanserai, Slavic porters unloading furs, Turkic merchants haggling over a wagon of young captives. A Byzantine monk watches silently, noting prices and names. To the west, the Dnieper flows, dark and patient, carrying the wealth of the forest to the cities of the sea. The 8th century Khazar Khaganate is unlike the brute empires that came before. It is a node of systems, tribal yet bureaucratic, nomadic yet mercantile. It controls rivers, overland routes, and trade towns. What the Avars ruled by fear, the Khazars rule by structure. They do not merely raid villages, they tax the raiders. Into this structure flow the Slavs, increasingly settled and stratified. Some become clients, others remain prey. A Slavic chieftain might swear loyalty to a Khazar governor in exchange for protection or trade licenses. Another might sell his rival's children to buy salt and bronze. Slavery becomes embedded in the logic of exchange. Khazar officials even develop standardized systems for assessing slave value based on age, health, and utility. The most prized? Young Slavic girls and boys, unscarred, able to serve in Arab courts or Byzantine villas. These captives are marched through Khazar territory, taxed at river fords and trading posts, and sold southward. Meanwhile, Byzantium watches with wary admiration. Cherson remains a gateway for southern trade. Missionaries occasionally venture northward, but Byzantium now relies on its northern partners, especially the Khazars, to maintain the frontier. The empire's interests are served so long as order holds and slaves arrive. Ethnic identity in this world is both fixed and fungible. The Khazars tolerate many peoples under their rule, and even adopt Judaism as a political religious counterbalance to Christian Byzantium and Islamic Baghdad. Slavs become more culturally distinct. Linguistic and material patterns emerge, but their social status remains ambivalent. This is a period of systemic integration. Political structures now amplify and formalize exploitation, rather than simply benefiting from it opportunistically. Conflict becomes bureaucratized, slavery becomes industrial. The 9th century began with the sound of oars. In the north, where the forests thicken and rivers bend like slow-moving serpents, new ships have appeared. Low-slung, dragon-prowed vessels slicing across the Volga and Dnieper. Their crews are not local. They speak a hard, clipped tongue from a cold sea far away, where winter never leaves the bones. These are the Varangians. Norsemen come not only to raid, but to build a place for themselves in the world they have discovered. A land of deep rivers, rich soil, and undefended wealth. They come first in scattered bands, trailing behind trade caravans and raiding parties. But soon, they begin to settle. They learn the rivers like native sons, and they take their place among the fragile powers that already rule here. To the east, the Khazars, descended from steppe nomads but organized now into a state, control the trade corridors like toll-keepers of a hidden empire. Their cities are distant, near the Caspian, but their reach is long. They do not need to ride out to assert dominance. They can sit and count silver while others do the work of bringing it to them. The work, more often than not, is done with chains. Throughout the forest steppe of Ukraine, Slavic villages dot the riverbanks. Small, self-sufficient, but unprotected, they live by what the soil gives: rye, millet, flax, hides. Families gather harvests and carry offerings to the gods carved into wood at the forest's edge. But beyond the fields, the world has grown dangerous. Khazar agents and Varangian war bands sweep down the rivers not only for trade, but for people. Captives are currency. One boy or girl is worth more than a wagon load of grain. These villages have no walls. Some build wooden palisades. Others simply hope. A few align themselves with a stronger tribe, or even pay tribute to local Khazar representatives. But the raids are frequent, and always brutal. Survivors speak of children dragged from fields, elders slain, whole communities burned and emptied. Those taken vanish into a vast and invisible system, sold southward through the Khazar towns, or carried east by river to be sold in the slave markets of the Islamic world, where the buyers speak Arabic, and the prices are set by age and beauty. Even the Crimean peninsula, still touched by the long hand of Byzantium, has become part of this machinery. In ports like Cherson and Kerch, Greek-speaking traders receive Slavic captives alongside furs and wax. The cities remain nominally imperial, but the empire's grasp here is loose. It is the network that matters, the quiet transactional agreements between Khazar tax agents, Byzantine merchants, and Norse river captains. In this world, there is no clear center, but many edges. Power comes not from armies, but from the control of routes. The Dnieper is not just a river, it is a road of extraction. Those who live near it live on the edge of being taken. The captives taken in these years will never return. They become house slaves in Aleppo, eunuchs in Baghdad, or concubines in Constantinople. The Slavic word for slave, rob, begins to circulate beyond its borders, and still the ships come. By the turn of the 10th century, the shape of the land begins to change. Where once there were tribes, now there is a court. Kiev, perched above a bend in the Dnieper, rises not from peace, but from consolidation. The Norse chiefs have become princes, and they rule not by the sword alone, but by inheritance, tribute, and control. A dynasty has begun, the Rurikids, and with them a new chapter. Their capital is a city of markets and fortresses where Slavic peasants pay tribute in grain and hides, and Varangian guards patrol with silver-studded axes. It is here that the machinery of the land is retooled. What the Khazars once taxed, the princes of Kiev now claim for themselves, but the system remains the same. Slavery has not diminished, it has been internalized. Now it is the princes of Rus who send raiding parties into the forests and steppes. Now it is Slavs who enslave Slavs, or turn their weapons against the Finnic tribes to the north, or the steppe nomads to the east. The Dnieper runs as full of captives as ever, chained, branded, driven south. Where once the Khazars facilitated, Kiev now organizes. The same road, but under new management. Christianity arrives in 988, and with it, the solemn rites of Byzantium. Prince Vladimir converts, marries a Byzantine princess, and baptizes the people of his realm in the cold waters of the Dnieper. Icons are carried upriver. Churches are built in wood and stone. And yet the traffic in human flesh does not falter. The cross does not unmake the chain. Religion brings legitimacy, not restraint. In fact, Christian Kiev now has easier access to Christian markets. And not all the captives are pagans. Political theology will find its justifications. They are heretics, schismatics, barbarians, rebels. There is always a reason. In Crimea, Byzantine fortresses gleam white against the sea, and Italian merchants from Amalfi and Venice begin to make quiet appearances in the deeper harbors. These cities do not wage war, they trade, and what they trade is often people. By the end of the 10th century, the system is stable. The fields of the forest steppe feed the cities, the surplus population harvested like grain feeds the markets, and the Dnieper carries all of it, silver, wheat, souls. There is peace, but it is not gentle. It is the peace of organized extraction, of a world that has learned how to profit from its own fragmentation, of a state born from piracy that has become a broker of captives. This is not yet empire, but it is order, and that is enough to keep the ships moving. At the turn of the first millennium, the bells of Kiev ring in the cool morning air. The city, perched high above the Dnieper, gleams with new stone churches and golden domes. It is the age of Yaroslav the Wise, and in his court gather envoys from the Franks, the Danes, and Constantinople. The princes of Rus have become lords of a new political order, one that measures itself not only by conquest, but by cathedral and law code, dynastic marriage and treaty. Yet outside the walls, nothing has truly changed. The peasants who till the fields of the Dnieper basin still bow to their local lord. They still owe tribute, first in grain and flax, then in hides or honey. But when the harvest fails or wars drain the coffers, the next offering is people. This is not raiding in the chaotic sense of earlier centuries. It is systematic coercion, tribute reimagined. A village slow to pay may find itself punished, its able-bodied youth carted off in ox-drawn wagons, marched to the riverside and handed over to merchants who pay in silver. Some are prisoners of war, some are criminals or debtors, some are simply expendable. From Kiev to Crimea, the trade flows smoothly. The steppe, still wild and violent, teems with Turkic raiders, especially the Cumans, who harass border towns, burn crops, and disappear back into the grasslands with ropes of captives. Sometimes they raid alone. More often they work through local Rus princes, striking where their allies' rivals are weakest, and then sharing the profits. And Crimea remains the hinge. Greek-speaking towns like Cherson still answer to Constantinople, at least in form, and Byzantine administrators buy what the river brings. They require laborers for their estates, soldiers for their border garrisons, eunuchs for their palaces. The empire may speak of Christ, but it still knows the price of a man's back or a woman's womb. The trade is open, not celebrated but not hidden. In markets near the coast, Slavic boys and girls stand in rows, inspected like livestock. Some are already branded, marked as property. Others wait, eyes wide, for the next stage of their journey, to a merchant ship, to a slave market in Trebizond, to a lord's estate on the Aegean shore. And in the courts of Rus, none of this is condemned. It is acknowledged. It is normalized. Princes marry into the houses of Europe. They receive bishops and build monasteries. But behind the veil of Christian piety lies a quiet logic of power. We take what we can, and we sell what we cannot use. No moral contradiction is allowed to threaten this structure. The same leaders who fund the writing of the first Rus law codes also sign the deals that send entire village populations into bondage. There is no rupture between law and enslavement. They are part of the same order. By the 12th century, the golden calm of Kiev has begun to unravel. The sons of princes have become princes themselves. The state, never truly unified, fractures into rival principalities, Galicia, Volhynia, Chernihiv, Suzdal, and others, each ruled by a descendant of the old line, each hungering for control of trade routes, tribute towns, and farmland. Kiev is still sacred, but it is no longer central. As unity dissolves, so does restraint. Raiding becomes internal, no longer just a matter of fending off steppe nomads, but of exploiting one's neighbors. A feud between two Rus princes might end not in battle, but in a raid on a border village, burned to ash, its people taken not for punishment, but for profit. Where once the Khazars and the Norse had defined the rhythms of captivity, now the Russians enslaved themselves. The Cumans rise to power in the southern steppe. They are fast, unpredictable, and ruthlessly effective. They strike where the land is richest and the defenses weakest, targeting villages, monasteries, and caravans. Their warbands vanish into the grasslands before retaliation is even mustered. They bring captives to Crimea, and there they find waiting buyers, not only Greeks now but also Italians, especially merchants from Genoa and Venice, whose interests in Black Sea commerce are growing quietly, strategically. In the Crimean ports, especially in Sudak and Kaffa, the slave trade continues uninterrupted. The Byzantine Empire, weakened by internal crisis and external pressure, still maintains a grip on coastal fortresses, but it is the market that rules now, not the emperor. And the market is thriving. Ethnic boundaries mean little in this world. The captives are overwhelmingly Slavs, but not only. Finnic tribes, steppe dwellers, even Turkic groups fall victim to the same cycles of abduction and sale. The shared fate is commodification. Identity is reduced to price. This is no longer frontier slavery, no longer the byproduct of war. It is an infrastructure. Captive taking is a political strategy, a military tactic, and an economic necessity. There is always a prince who needs silver. There is always a merchant who needs labor. There is always a village too poor or too remote to defend itself. And so the 12th century closes not with unification but with dispersion and dismemberment. The land is a patchwork of claims and counterclaims, of princes and pretenders, of alliances that last a season and feuds that last a generation. And across it all moves the silent engine of the slave trade, steady, profitable, unquestioned. The Dnieper flows on, heavy with bodies, bound for a coast that always buys. The riders came like smoke. They moved faster than messengers, struck harder than thunder. When the Mongols reached the lands of Rus, they came not to negotiate, not to take tribute, but to announce a new order. Kiev burned in 1240, its churches smashed, its people slaughtered or enslaved. Cities that once traded captives now became supply points for their own. But even this devastation was not chaos. It was conquest with a plan. From the ashes of Kiev rose the Golden Horde, a Mongol polity governed less by swords than by ledgers, taxes, and charters. Rus princes were not abolished, they were repurposed. Those who bent the knee were granted charters of rule, and with those charters came obligations: grain, silver, horses, and people. And tribute became the backbone of the new regime, and the human element was no longer incidental. Mongol administrators demanded captives not just for sale but for their own internal economy, labor for roads, herds, fortresses, and far-flung campaigns, and for the markets, always the markets. In the Crimean Peninsula, ports like Soldaya, Sudak, thrived under horde protection. Slave caravans came from the north, laden with Slavic peasants taken in punitive raids or sold by their own lords, their wrists bound with rope, their eyes dulled with hunger. These captives were not always war spoils. Sometimes they were tax, measured, exacted, delivered like sheaves of wheat. A peasant family in the lower Dnieper basin, who had survived earlier centuries of raids and tithes, now lived with a new certainty, that one or more of their children could be seized to meet a noble's Mongol tribute obligation, to disappear south, past the steppe, into the belly of the empire. The horde's dominance was efficient. Its roads were guarded and smooth, its couriers faster than any before. It mattered little whether one was Slavic, Turkic, or Finnic. All could be taken. What mattered was proximity to power, to ports, and to population centers. The more fertile the land, the more valuable the captives. The system absorbed everything and spared no one. Even Rus princes raided one another, not only to win territory, but to harvest people to keep the horde satisfied and to fund their own ambitions. The slave trade was no longer peripheral. It was a governing tool. By the 14th century, the machinery was no longer new, it was refined. The Golden Horde remained dominant, though now fissured with internal rivalries and civil wars. But even these disruptions fed the same engine. Factions fought, settlements burned, and captives flowed south through the steppe along the Black Sea coast into the hands of those who knew what to do with them. Crimea, more than ever, became the nerve center of human trafficking. The Genoese, once a maritime merchant power, now ruled enclaves like Kaffa, Theodosia, fortified with stone and ringed with towers. Within those walls, beneath the banners of St. George, stood the greatest slave market in the Christian world. Buyers came from Egypt, from Syria, from Italian ports, and from Byzantium itself. Ships left with cargoes not only of spices or silk, but of Slavic girls, Circassian warriors, Georgian nobles, and nameless peasants from the steppes. The scene was ritualized. A merchant might inspect a boy's teeth like a horse's. A woman might be sold with a promise of docility, or fertility, or silence. Families were separated as policy to prevent resistance. Branding, cataloging, and reselling became an administrative art. The Genoese knew who their suppliers were: Tatar raiders, Rus princes, local warlords, and they paid accordingly. The Italians did not raid, they did not need to. The system delivered its goods. Throughout the interior, villages grew again on the ashes of those burned decades before. The land always replenished itself, and this was the cruel brilliance of the system. Its fuel source, its raw material, human life, grew back as long as there was sun and rain. Even those principalities that began to assert autonomy, like Suzdal or Moscow, did not escape the network. Their taxes went to the horde. Their captives, when taken, passed through the same roads, the same forts, the same coastal gates. Slavery had become institutionalized, international, and entirely normalized. The Golden Horde ruled not only by conquest, but by integration into systems of trade, of diplomacy, of family alliances. A Mongol noble might marry a Kipchak woman and trade with an Armenian merchant in a Genoese port while selling Slavic captives taken by a Rus vassal. This was not a clash of civilizations. It was a web, a multicultural slave empire held together not by ideology, but by the steady flow of wealth and people. Even as the Mongol state showed signs of fragmentation, its economic rhythms remained intact. Roads were still patrolled, merchants still paid tolls, and in the Crimean ports, the auctions never stopped. The first snows are melting in the northern steppe when the riders gather. Under standards of red and black, bearing curved sabers and lances tipped with iron, they ride out from Bakhchisarai, the new seat of the Crimean Khanate. These are not scattered bands of raiders. They are organized cavalry units commanded by nobles of Tatar lineage, and they ride not in defiance of empire, but in service of it. By mid-century, the Golden Horde has fractured, and out of its bones, the Crimean Khanate takes shape, leaner, faster, and tethered tightly to the growing might of the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan in Istanbul wants slaves, household servants, soldiers, eunuchs, concubines, bureaucrats. And the Khans of Crimea provide them regularly, predictably, and on a scale that would rival grain shipments. Each year they raid deep into the Dnieper basin, riding for days across grasslands into the villages of Slavic peasants. The resistance is disorganized. Muscovy is still finding its shape in the north. Poland, Lithuania, and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania compete for slices of western Ukraine. The central steppe, it belongs to no one, or more precisely, it belongs to those who can take from it. The land is too rich to be ignored. The fields yield harvests. The villages are full, and for every family burned out and taken south in chains, a new one will sprout in a generation. The soil refills the slave pens. In Kaffa, now bustling with Genoese merchants, the trade is as formal as any other. The docks are crowded with goods and captives alike. Invoices are drawn up, duties are paid, the captives are catalogued, Slavs, Circassians, Georgians, Armenians, and sorted according to value. Women of childbearing age are prized. Boys without marks or injuries command higher fees. Whole families may be sold intact or divided as the buyer prefers. The Genoese do not capture, they do not kill. They facilitate, providing ships, currency, and connections across the Mediterranean. From their towers and counting houses, they profit from the labor of others, even as the world around them smolders with blood and fire. Meanwhile, on the steppes, ethnic lines are not blurred. They are weaponized. Tatar is hunter, Slavic is prey. The exceptions are few, and even they are not spared when the columns of riders descend without warning in the early morning mist. The wind cuts low across the steppe, flattening the yellow grasses as hooves thunder in the distance. A village elder wakes before dawn, not to birdsong, but to the silence that comes before a raid. Dogs have vanished. Children are hushed. A mother clutches her son's hand as they hurry into the earth-warmed cellar, the door above them hidden by straw. She knows they may not return if caught. The riders will not pause. They are coming for bodies, not grain. By the 16th century, the system no longer grows. It endures. The Crimean Khanate, at the peak of its power, runs on a calendar of raids. Its warriors are subsidized not through taxes or land grants, but through the flesh of captives. A successful raid means profit. A failed raid means ruin. The incentives are built into the very structure of the state. Ottoman markets are insatiable. Istanbul, Cairo, Tunis, all demand labor for their fields, galleys, harems, and courts. Kaffa remains a hub, though Venetians and Ottomans now share the space, jostling for advantage. The entire peninsula becomes a kind of logistics base for the slave economy, its fortresses and warehouses echoing with the footsteps of bound travelers from 1,000 villages. In the north, Muscovy is no longer a collection of rival principalities. It is a growing state with a new title, Tsardom. Under Ivan III and later Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, Moscow begins to extend its reach southward, building fortified lines and colonizing contested territory. But the raids do not stop. They only become more violent. In the west, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth now stretches into central Ukraine, establishing not safety, but serfdom. The peasantry is bound to land often by charter or decree, unable to flee, unable to defend itself. A man who cannot move is as easy to seize as one in chains. To the southeast, a new kind of community takes root, the Cossacks. Runaways from serfdom, outlaws, warriors, and dreamers. They live in fortified camps along the rivers and marshes. They raid in turn, striking back at Crimean towns, capturing Tatars, ransoming them or selling them north. They are no abolitionists. They are a mirror reflecting the violence back, blade for blade. And so, the slave economy becomes cyclical. No longer one-sided, it feeds on conflict between raiders and counter-raiders, fueled by state ambition, ethnic division, and the permanent vulnerability of the land's fertility. Where fields yield grain, they yield people. In a village outside Chernihiv, a boy wakes to the sound of hooves. He has never seen a Tatar before, but he knows the stories. His father grabs a scythe, his mother hides the youngest in a cellar. The horses come fast, there is no time. In Kaffa, a ship waits in harbor. Below decks are 36 captives. They do not know where they are going. They do not know that they are cargo, numbered and bought, destined for cities whose names they have never heard. Their families will vanish behind them like smoke in the wind. This is the world as it stands at the close of the 16th century. Not a chaos of cruelty, but an economy of precision, where race and religion, language and law all bend toward the same function, to organize the extraction of life from the land and to sell it. The campfire burns low in the Zaporizhian night. Around it, Cossack riders sharpen sabers, smoke clay pipes, and whisper rumors of Polish taxes and Tatar raids. One swears he saw a caravan yesterday, dozens of captives roped together, heading south. Another grins and spits. Next time we'll take some of our own. Vengeance, profit, survival, it all blurs beneath the stars. Spring comes late to the steppe, but when it does, it brings more than thaw and green shoots. It brings hooves. In this century, the Crimean Khanate, now a client of the Ottoman Empire, sends its raiders like clockwork, not as rogue bands, but as policy. Each year, thousands of mounted Tatars ride north, armed with bows, sabers, lassos, and iron discipline. They penetrate far into the borderlands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, into the Muscovite periphery, even toward Belarus and the outskirts of Moscow. They know the roads, the rivers, the rhythms of the peasant harvest. They ride for one thing: people. Their target is the Ukrainian peasantry, now caught in a deadly vice. From the west, Polish nobles tighten the noose of serfdom, formalizing it, expanding it, binding the peasantry to estates with laws and taxes. From the south, the Khanate comes with fire and rope. Slavic villages become corridors of suffering, each year's crops shadowed by the threat of disappearance. Estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of people are taken in the 17th century. Some are ransomed. Some die on the march. Most are sold in Kaffa or shipped across the Black Sea to Istanbul and Cairo, where demand for labor, soldiers, and concubines remains steady. This is not a backwater slave trade. It is a central engine of wealth and war, embedded in statecraft and imperial planning. But the system has an echo. The Cossacks, no longer mere frontier drifters, now form an entire social and military order. In the south, at the Zaporizhian Sich, they carve out autonomy, Orthodox, Slavic, fiercely militant, and as dependent on raiding as those they fight. The Cossacks strike back into the Khanate and Ottoman lands, taking Tatars and Turks, sometimes trading them for Slavic captives, sometimes selling them for coin. They do not reject the system, they mirror it. It all explodes in 1648 when Bohdan Khmelnytsky leads the Cossack uprising, a revolt against Polish overlords, against serfdom, against Catholic domination. It is not a clean rebellion, it becomes a social convulsion. Peasants rise, towns are sacked. Jews, nobles, and administrators are massacred in waves. And in the chaos, the lines between freedom fighter and slaver blur even further. In 1654, the Treaty of Pereyaslav binds the Cossacks to Muscovy, a calculated shift in allegiance. In exchange for autonomy, they pledge fealty to a czar whose empire is only beginning to sense its potential. The immediate result is protection. The long-term result is absorption. Muscovy does not need to raid. It begins instead to administer. Its power lies in census, in charter, in decree. It offers something new, a system that binds not with chains but with ink. The columns of Russian troops stretch across the horizon like a line of smoke. Behind them follow the wagons, filled not with loot but with ledgers. Forts rise where pastures once stood. Surveyors, not raiders, chart the land now. In a village near Poltava, a noble reads out the names of his serfs for a new imperial census. A boy listens as his family is counted, not as citizens, but as assets. By the dawn of the 18th century, the world has changed, but its logic holds. The Crimean Khanate is still raiding, but it is fading. Its riders reach the Dnieper less often. Its alliances fray. The Ottoman world, though vast, cannot hold the frontier as it once did. And the Russian Empire, under Peter the Great, is moving south with roads, fortresses, and legions. The Cossacks, once wild, are now folded into the state. They ride still but under orders. They fight in imperial wars, suppress rebellions, extend the Tsar's reach. Their autonomy contracts. Their raids are no longer their own. But the slave trade does not disappear. It is transformed. Where once raiders swept across the steppe, now imperial officials impose serfdom in its final form. This is not a euphemism. It is a system where peasants are legally attached to the land, where they are bought and sold with estates, where a noble may trade a family to settle a debt, or offer them to the state in exchange for favor. The soul tax, introduced by Peter, is a bureaucratic brand, a way to count bodies as capital. Each peasant becomes a unit of wealth, measured and mobilized. In newly conquered Ukrainian territories, the system takes root quickly. Polish serfdom is replaced not by liberation, but by imperial order. Censuses, registers, commands. And still the frontier advances. Under Catherine the Great, the final blow is struck. In 1783, Russia formally annexes Crimea. The Genoese are long gone. The Ottomans are weakened. The Khanate collapses. Its lands are seized. Its raiding ends. The slave markets of Kaffa are shuttered, and yet the people remain unfree. Now they are serfs of the empire. They live and die on land they do not own. Their labor is taxed, their movement restricted. their names written into volumes of state archives. The empire does not raid villages, it owns them. Ethnic Tatars, once feared, are now subjugated minorities, many displaced, others absorbed, watched carefully. Russian settlers pour in. Orthodox churches rise, administrative maps are redrawn. Crimea becomes not a frontier, but a province. And so, by the end of the 18th century, the system is not gone, it is simply perfected. The chain has become the document. The raider has become the registrar. The slave has become the serf, and the steppe, forever fertile, forever haunted, continues to yield its people, not to markets now, but to empire. When the 19th century begins, serfdom is absolute. From the Carpathians to the Caucasus, the vast bulk of the Russian Empire's population is unfree, legally tied to land owned by nobles, the state, or the church. A peasant cannot leave without permission. He can be sold, inherited, mortgaged. His labor is owed to his master, and his presence is counted in soul registers, the same term used in earlier centuries for tithes of silver, grain, or human lives. In Ukraine, this system takes on a particularly loaded meaning. The right bank, once Polish-Lithuanian, now under Russian control, is populated by a peasantry that is ethnically Slavic, linguistically Ruthenian or Ukrainian, and religiously Orthodox, but ruled by a landowning class often Polish, Catholic, or Russified. The tensions are both class and cultural, layered with the memory of centuries of raiding, tribute, and exclusion. The Tatars of Crimea, once masters of the steppe, are now a conquered people. After the annexation of 1783, waves of displacement and migration begin. Some flee to the Ottoman lands. Others remain, gradually marginalized by waves of Russian, Armenian, Greek, and Ukrainian settlers, many of whom arrive under state resettlement programs designed to pacify and Russify the region. Crimea, once a cosmopolitan Slav entrepot, is now an imperial periphery, militarized, monitored, and reimagined as a Russian possession in both myth and law. The ports are no longer slave markets, but naval outposts. The memory of slavery is erased from architecture and replaced with monuments to conquest. And yet, the deeper logic remains. The empire still treats human life as an extractive resource. Nowhere is this clearer than in the state's use of internal exile and forced resettlement. Entire families are relocated for perceived disloyalty. Minorities are moved to balance regional demographics. Political dissidents vanish into Siberian villages or labor colonies. Displacement becomes a bureaucratic function, not a military one. But the great turning point of the century comes in 1861 when Tsar Alexander II abolishes serfdom. It is not a clean emancipation. The peasants are freed, but without land. They must buy their own soil back from landlords at inflated prices. They are still registered, still taxed, still subject to communal controls, and now burdened with debt that will last generations. Many remain exactly where they were. Others drift, rootless, into cities or frontier settlements, trading bondage for precarity. For the state, the logic of control simply changes form. The peasantry is now managed through obligations of credit, service, and movement restrictions rather than ownership. The law remains a cage, even if the key has changed hands. Throughout the empire, and especially in Ukraine, the century sees wave after wave of Russification policies. The imperial center, anxious about Polish nationalism, Cossack memory, and Ukrainian cultural revival, clamps down on language, faith, and identity. Ukrainian language publications are banned, Cossack traditions are rewritten, then erased. Orthodox practice is promoted as a tool of imperial unity. Even education becomes a battleground. Literacy is encouraged, but only in Russian. To read, to write, to speak in one's own language becomes an act of subversion. In the south, the empire continues its long-term transformation of the land. Forests are cleared, canals dug, railroads built. The former frontier is now a colonized interior, and the imperial presence is marked not by caravans, but by stations, garrisons, and grain depots. The old economy of slavery has vanished, but what has taken its place is a matrix of control even more insidious. It does not need to take people away from their homes. It simply defines those homes as invisible prisons. And then, toward the century's end, the ground begins to shake again. The peasantry, promised liberty, finds itself still poor, still hungry, still without land. National awakenings stir in Ukraine and Poland. Jewish communities, caught in the crosshairs of rising xenophobia and state suspicion, face new rounds of pogroms and forced relocations. The state, panicked and reactive, doubles down on surveillance, censorship, conscription. Meanwhile, revolutionary voices begin to whisper in taverns and factories. The 20th century began with the illusion of progress. Trains arrived in dusty towns. Telegraph poles marched across the horizon. In Kiev and Odessa, bookstores sold Tolstoy beside Marx, while villages still tilled their grain with wooden plows. The Tsar reigned, but unrest curled around his cities like smoke. The peasantry, especially in Ukraine's fertile center, had known the so-called end of serfdom for 40 years, and yet they still bowed to landlords, paid in grain, buried children early and moved only with permission. Nothing fundamental had changed, only the paperwork. In the countryside, memory was long. People remembered the Tatar raids, they remembered the nobles' whips, but the pain of the past had not sharpened them into revolutionaries. It had made them patient. That patience broke in 1905, then again in 1917. The Tsar's regime fell not to the peasants, but to war and hunger, and the Bolsheviks rushed in with promises not of land but of transformation. For a moment it was chaos. Not liberation, not yet, but dislocation, pure and total. Armies passed like thunderclouds, flags changed weekly, Ukrainian independence was declared and denied, Poland rose again, the Cossacks rode once more. The whites came to restore order, the reds to erase it, the anarchists to burn it all. Villages were gunned down, shtetls were emptied by flame and sabers. Rail lines became arteries of panic and escape. In that brief interregnum, the old captivity of the land was joined by the new captivity of ideology. And the dead began to multiply, not as collateral but as fuel. By the time the Bolsheviks stood alone in the smoldering shell of the old empire, they did not rebuild it. They re-engineered it. No longer would people be controlled by nobles or priests. They would be managed, they would be measured, documented, and placed. Ukraine, with its grain, its rivers, its memory of revolt, was never trusted. It was called a republic, but treated like a colony. The peasant, once mocked as backward, was now denounced as an enemy. The Bolsheviks called it collectivization, but the villagers knew it by other names. Livestock disappeared overnight into state trucks. Private fields were burned, then replanted under signs bearing Stalin's slogans. Those who resisted were denounced as kulaks, rich, selfish, counter-revolutionary, and vanished. Some were exiled to the Siberian forests. Others ended up in the camps, Kolyma, Solovki, Vorkuta, places that didn't exist on any map. There they dug canals through permafrost with bare hands, logged forests until their spines broke, and died unnamed, often unburied. It was not slavery, the state insisted, it was reform through labor. But the prisoners called it what it was, slow death. And then, in 1932, came the famine. The harvests were average, maybe even strong, but the grain was seized anyway, bound for cities, for export, for quotas that had no logic but obedience. Entire villages in Ukraine and the Kuban were blacklisted. No food, no trade. Armed patrols circled them like siege engines. Children begged for crusts. Mothers fed grass to their babies. Neighbors turned away from each other, too weak for mourning. In a single winter, millions died. Fields lay silent. No birds sang. The living could no longer bury the dead. When it was over, there were no memorials, only records hidden in basements. The same trains that had once brought goods and people to the frontiers now carted whole communities into silence. The Soviet state emerged from the famine not weakened but stronger, because it had proven that death could be used as a tool. Then came the war. In 1939, with the ink of the Non-Aggression Pact still wet, the Soviets carved up Poland. Western Ukraine, its towns and hills, was absorbed overnight. New border posts appeared, so did deportation orders. Poles were sent east. Ukrainians were registered and monitored. When Germany turned on the Soviet Union in 1941, the entire region was already braced for occupation. But no one could imagine what came next. The Nazis did not rule Ukraine. They emptied it. They gunned down entire Jewish villages beside open pits, Babi Yar, Bogdanovka, Drohobych, Vinnytsia, leaving only the bloodstains in the grass. They deported Ukrainian men and women to work in German factories, calling them Ostarbeiter and marking their uniforms with a crude O. They torched partisans alive in barns, sent columns of children to be Germanized, and left the land cracked, smoldering, and carved into zones of use and destruction. Yet when the Red Army returned, the killing did not stop. Now, vengeance ruled. Villages suspected of disloyalty were razed. Women who had slept with Germans were shaved and beaten in public squares. Whole communities were accused by ethnicity, by rumor, by origin. The NKVD moved quickly, precisely. Arrests came at night, trains rolled east again. In May 1944, the Crimean Tatars, every man, woman and child, were given minutes to pack before they were herded into freight cars. Their destination was not known. Many died en route, others starved in exile. Their homes were seized, their cemeteries bulldozed, their history replaced with silence. They were not the only ones. Greeks, Armenians, Germans, Chechens, Poles, all were moved like furniture in a room no longer theirs. By 1950, the steppe was still fertile. The trains still ran, the files were still updated. But now the system no longer needed to raid, to burn, to brand. It had learned to erase more efficiently. The old empires had enslaved with chains. This new one did it with law, with fear, with hunger, with the rewriting of names. The people were no longer bound to the land by birth or blood. They were bound by the weight of memory unspoken, by loss so constant it became a fact of life. And still, in secret, the songs were sung. The prayers were whispered. The dead were remembered. Not in books, not in statues, but in silence passed from mother to daughter, from father to son, across a land that had never been allowed to forget. By 1950, the Gulag camps were full but still expanding. The roads built by the dead, the rail lines stretching into permafrost, the canals that flowed with the bones of their makers, all stood as monuments to a nation of prisons. But this was no longer the age of Stalin's chaos. Now, the system sought order. After Stalin's death in 1953, there was a moment, just a moment, when it seemed the grip might loosen. Khrushchev's secret speech condemned the worst of the terror. Some prisoners returned, some names were spoken aloud again, but there were limits. The gulags shrank, but did not disappear. The files were not burned. And even as the tanks rolled out of Budapest, even as Crimea was quietly transferred from the Russian Republic to the Ukrainian one in 1954, nothing fundamental changed about the logic of rule. The people still belonged to the state, and the state answered to no one. In Ukraine, collectivized agriculture remained the cage in which the peasantry lived and died. Fields were plowed not for profit but for quotas. Those who whispered about the famine, the purges, the deportations, they did so at risk of work, of family, of freedom. The past was not to be remembered. It was to be rewritten. Cultural life became an arena of quiet battle. Ukrainian poets, historians, priests, all were watched. Language itself was regulated. The term Ukrainian could be spoken, but only in Soviet terms. The flag, the anthem, the memory of independence, all were illegal. In Kyiv, the churches that had survived the war were torn down or turned into warehouses. In Galicia, where the Greek Catholic Church had once stood between East and West, its clergy were driven underground. Faith became resistance. Culture became a crime. The Crimean Tatars, deported in 1944, remained in exile. Their homeland was now fully colonized, its cities renamed, its history erased. When they petitioned to return, peacefully, legally, they were ignored or arrested. The word Tatar disappeared from textbooks. Cemeteries crumbled in the weeds, and yet something always survived. By the 1960s and 70s, a generation emerged who remembered what their parents had whispered. They published samizdat, handwritten dissident literature passed in secret. They formed the Ukrainian Helsinki group. They wrote poems in banned languages. They were jailed, institutionalized, silenced, but they did not stop. The underground became a nation beneath the nation. In the cities, modernity arrived. Apartment blocks rose like concrete forests. Trams hummed. Televisions flickered with the face of Brezhnev. But the cities were also corridors of conformity. Jobs were tied to ideology, housing to obedience. A single act of defiance, a joke, a prayer, a question could cost you your life's stability. Not your life, not anymore. But the walls would close in just the same. Even history was managed. The Holodomor was not taught. The deportations were not named. World War II became a single, sanitized tale. The Great Patriotic War, where the Soviet people, undifferentiated, uncriticized, triumphed over fascism. The fact that so many Ukrainians had died twice, once under Hitler, once under Stalin, was written out. And then came Chernobyl. In April 1986, the reactor melted and the truth followed. The state lied. It silenced doctors. It sent children back to school under a radioactive sky. And the people, for the first time in a long time, knew the silence was deadly. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was poison. The masks began to slip. Protests rose. Not many at first, but enough. Language laws were questioned. Cultural organizations reappeared. Old flags were pulled from closets. By the end of the 1980s, the empire was rotting from within. The walls still stood, but the voices had returned. In 1991, Ukraine declared independence. The statue still stood in Kyiv, but now it looked over a crowd carrying blue and yellow banners, singing banned songs, reclaiming a history that had never died, only been driven underground. The empire had collapsed, but the wounds it left behind, in memory, in bureaucracy, in the inherited fear of speaking, of asking, of remembering, those would not vanish overnight. They would remain embedded in institutions and languages in the very soil of the steppe. When Ukraine declared independence in 1991, it was not breaking free from one captor, but inheriting the wreckage of a collapsed system of organized unfreedom. Slave markets had long closed. The institutions that had replaced them, work farms, gulags, had emptied. Internal deportations had ceased, but the patterns left behind, the habits of domination, the informal economies of bodies, the black channels of control, they remained. The economy shattered, salaries evaporated. Whole industries were dismantled or sold for pennies to men who had grown rich in the backrooms of the Soviet state. Ukraine became, almost overnight, a zone of desperation. And in desperation, human life became once again currency. Trafficking surged, not metaphorically, literally. Ukrainian women were recruited through fake job ads and modeling agencies, then sold into brothels in Istanbul, Tel Aviv, Rome, or Berlin. They disappeared into debt bondage, stripped not just of papers, but of identities. Girls as young as 12 were taken from the villages of the Carpathians, or the Black Sea coast, and placed into rooms where the door never opened unless someone had paid. Organized crime facilitated this trade, but it did not invent it. It thrived because the state was too weak, too corrupt, or too complicit to act. Local police were bought. Border guards were silent. Officials issued permits or looked away. Ukraine became one of the largest sources of trafficked persons in Europe, not because of its laws, but because it had no functioning law at all. And it was not just sexual slavery. Men were smuggled into construction sites in Moscow, into farms in southern Italy, into sweatshops in Warsaw, unregistered, underpaid, unsafe. Many were never paid at all. Others were locked into barracks and told they owed their traffickers for transport, food, even the boots on their feet. This was a new kind of slavery, not racial, not hereditary, but economic, systemic, and invisible. It wore no uniform, it used no chains, but it was no less violent. At the same time, the borderlands became hubs for smuggling not only of people, but of drugs, weapons, and stolen goods. Entire regions fell under the quiet rule of mafia political alliances, particularly in the east and south. In these places, the trade in humans was not a failure of the system, it was the system. Meanwhile, Russia reasserted its influence not only through energy deals or media narratives, but through networks of controlled dependency. Ukrainian labor migrants in Russia were often undocumented, their status used to pressure families back home. Oligarchs with dual allegiances shaped policy through bribery and blackmail. Whole towns were economically tethered to Russian trade, while women and girls were exported like grain once was, quietly, in bulk, with no return. The 2004 Orange Revolution briefly interrupted this logic. It was a refusal, a pause in the cycle. But the system adapted. By the time Yanukovych returned to power in 2010, the underground economy of captivity was thriving again, protected by lawlessness and backed by Russian leverage. And when the Maidan rose in 2013, it rose not only against corruption, but against the ongoing theft of futures, the commodification of human life, and the return of imperial dependency by another name. The people stood, the president fled, and once again, those who profited from captivity decided to crush what they could not control. When Russia seized Crimea and ignited war in Donbass in 2014, it did not only take territory. It resurrected the economy of forced human movement, of seizure, deportation, and cultural erasure. It did not come to conquer land. It came to take people. In occupied Donetsk and Luhansk, Ukrainian citizens were abducted by separatist militias and Russian forces, held in basements, tortured, disappeared. These were not symbolic acts. They were the return of captivity as a method of governance. Local activists, journalists, teachers, anyone with a voice, was a target. Some were used in prisoner exchanges, others were never seen again. In Crimea, repression fell swiftly on Crimean Tatars, who had just begun to rebuild after exile. Mosques were raided, media shut down, community leaders vanished into Russian prisons. Some were charged with extremism, others were simply not heard from again. But the most grotesque chapter opened after the full-scale invasion of 2022. From the first days, Russian forces began not just to destroy cities, but to take civilians. Tens of thousands were forcibly deported from Mariupol and other occupied areas, sent to filtration camps in Russia, where they were interrogated, fingerprinted, registered, and often transported further into the interior. Families were separated. Phones were taken. Children disappeared. Over 19,000 Ukrainian children, by official counts, have been forcibly removed from occupied territories. Some were taken from orphanages or hospitals, others from families. Russia claims they were rescued, adopted into Russian families, renamed and re-educated. This is a revival of child expropriation, a tool used by colonizers for centuries to erase identity, to break memory. These children are not just victims of war, they are hostages to a vision of imperial continuity in which Ukraine's next generation is to be harvested. In cities like Kherson and Melitopol, people were rounded up for resisting. Young men were conscripted, teachers were forced to deliver a new curriculum or be replaced. Language itself became a battleground, Ukrainian banned, Russian enforced, just as it was a century earlier, and yet even here the old logic meets a new resistance. Ukraine today is struggling to survive, not just fighting for territory but documenting war crimes and tracing deported children. The United States' recent decision to suspend its investigation into these children threatens to condemn them to lives of servitude in one form or another. This is no longer a war only for borders. It is a war for the right to remain oneself, to remain unbroken and free from the long reach of a history that has always sought to own the bodies and lives of Ukrainians. The slave markets are underground. The steppe no longer echoes with hooves, but the same force, the desire to possess, to erase, to use human life as material, remains. And again it wears a military uniform. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was not an isolated act of war. It was the return of a pattern so old it has grown invisible, the logic of conquest not only over land but over people. Not merely to kill, but to take. Not only to occupy, but to extract and erase. And at the center of that pattern stand the children who have vanished. The Russian state claims these children are being protected, rescued, even adopted into loving homes. It says they were abandoned, orphaned by war, taken for their own safety. These claims are not evidence, they are propaganda. What is known is this: at least 19,000 children have been abducted from Ukrainian territory into Russia or Russian-occupied zones. Some were separated from their parents at filtration camps. Others were seized from hospitals, schools, shelters. Many were told they would be going to summer camps and never returned. Families have searched for years and found only silence. The majority of these children have not been heard from since. They are not visible in records. They are not accessible to family. They are not listed for return. Many are believed to have been re-registered, renamed and placed with Russian families, legally adopted under new identities in violation of international law, severed from their language, religion, culture, and kin. But we must say more, because the idea that all these children were merely adopted into stable homes is not only unfounded, it is implausible. Given the scale of trafficking, exploitation, and state-complicit crime across Russian-occupied territories and within the Russian Federation itself, including long-documented patterns of abuse, black market adoption, and human commodification, it is naive, even negligent, to assume that all or even most of these children have been placed safely. They were taken in wartime, in darkness, without transparency or accountability. Some were too young to speak for themselves, others were old enough to know they were being erased. This is not humanitarian relocation. It is enforced disappearance, and it is part of a broader system. This war, like so many before it on this soil, is not only a contest of arms. It is an operation of population engineering. In the occupied territories, Ukrainians are coerced into taking Russian passports to access food, pensions, medical care. Children are barred from Ukrainian schooling. Russian curricula are imposed. Resistance is punished with detention or death. Some disappear altogether. Villages are cleared. Homes are repopulated. Identities are erased, replaced, overwritten by force and by fiat. These are not accidental atrocities. They are administrative strategies, deployed through the same tools we have seen across centuries: enumeration, relocation, assimilation, destruction. Human lives converted into state instruments, disposable or claimable depending on the needs of empire. And yet the response from the international community, especially the United States, has been timid, partial, even quiet. The US government has denounced the abductions. It has supported the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova-Belova, his commissioner for children's rights. But in January 2025, the U.S. State Department quietly shut down its own task force investigating the forced transfer of Ukrainian children, citing lack of access. In response to mounting pressure, the State Department announced on March 28, 2025, that it would provide short-term funding to reinstate the Ukraine Conflict Observatory. But without political pressure on Russia, there is little chance any of these children will be returned. This is not a policy failure. It is a moral abdication. If the United States, so often self-identified as a global leader in human rights, cannot sustain even the investigation of thousands of disappeared children in the context of an active, well-documented war of aggression, what does that say about our ability to prevent the next iteration of this pattern? Because if this moment is allowed to fade into the static of war coverage, if these children are allowed to be lost in legal paperwork, to vanish behind euphemisms like adoption or relocation, then we have accepted again that some populations can be taken, that some children can be reclassified, and that slavery, when buried beneath enough bureaucracy, will no longer be seen for what it is. It must be said clearly, these children are not adopted. They are taken. This is not resettlement, it is abduction. And it demands more than condemnation. It demands action for the return of the children, for the preservation of their identities, for the accountability of those who orchestrated their erasure, and for the dismantling of the geopolitical logic that continues to make Ukraine a hunting ground for empire. Until that is done, the cycle is not broken. It is simply paused, waiting again for the moment when the world forgets that it has seen this before.